Okay, welcome everyone. We are here tonight for Faith Ringgold, Quilts, Paintings, and Politics. And we are excited because Jane Oneail, our art educator and art curator, is going to be leading this wonderful discussion. This is going to be about the artist Faith Ringgold. She's celebrated for her artistic career exploring race in the American experience. And our presenter, Jane Oneail, will be covering the breadth of Faith's creative output, including her paintings, her sculpture, her performance art, and of course, her beloved story quilts. So those are really very special. Again, the program tonight is sponsored by the Friends of Granby Public Library, so we want to give them a shout out. Now, about our presenter, Jane Oneail. She curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England. She holds a master's degree in art history from Boston University and a master's degree in education from Harvard University. A New Hampshire native, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, and more recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And I want to share this little quote that she has on her website. She appreciates the special magic that happens when people look at art together and they share genuine reactions and questions, which is going to make this a special program. So she says, talking about art requires bravery. You're inherently vulnerable when you share your perspective. There is joy in seeing things in a new way and in simply shifting gears to appreciate the beauty and poetry of everyday life. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing our program tonight with Jane. So let's give a warm welcome to Jane Oneail.
Thank you so much, Holly. And thank you for inviting me back for tonight's presentation, and to everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Faith Ringgold. I can tell that my internet connection is a little bit iffy right now. So Holly, if there's a major issue, please feel free to jump back in and let me know if we need to problem shoot there. But let's dive right into our subject matter. So we've got this beautiful image on the screen you've had the chance to look at, and this is of course one of Faith Ringgold's quilts. And what makes these quilts really special, as we'll learn throughout the evening, is that they are both pieced fabric and they're also paintings. So she uses acrylic paint to essentially make a quilt her canvas. And in this case, she's celebrating a man by the name of Sonny Rollins in this 1986 quilt. He's a preeminent jazz saxophonist, and he also happened to be one of her childhood friends. And so here you can see she's kind of celebrating New York City and his musical talent all together in one. So let's get started just with the overview of how we'll be spending the next hour together. Here we have the artist, Faith Ringgold, 91 years young. She's still alive today. And that being said, I think it's important to note that she still owns all of the images that we'll be looking at today. She has the copyright to them. So we're going to start off with an introduction to Faith Ringgold and a look at her life, especially leading up to becoming an artist. And then we'll turn our attention to her paintings and politics, how she advocated for social justice through her work, and then turn our attention to quilts and storytelling. And we'll sort of zoom in on one series of quilts in particular that I think of as sort of her masterwork, and then finish up with some of her more recent creative endeavors and what I think of as her renaissance. I think people are starting to re-examine her career, and there's a whole new level of appreciation there. So let's get started with Faith Ringgold and her life. She was born in 1930 in Harlem, New York, probably the most adorable baby you've ever seen. And over here, you can see her, the youngest of three siblings, and they're all outfitted very well because their mother actually made all of these coats for them. Their mother wasn't just a seamstress, she was a fashion designer. This is Faith Ringgold's mother here with her father. Here is her mother's business card over here. So fashion design, working with fabrics was a part of her upbringing and a part of her family legacy. This is sort of a grainy photo of Faith Ringgold's grandmother. So going back 2 generations here. And if you have really good eyesight, you can see she's standing in front of her own sign here that says dressmaking. So it almost seems like it's in the blood working with fabric here. It's inevitable. Here is a photograph of young Faith Ringgold walking down the street with her mother. Now, she said, she grew up in the Depression. She was living in Harlem, New York, but she never had any sense of being poor or of being oppressed. Harlem at that time was still sort of vibrating with the vibrancy of the Harlem Renaissance, which we typically think of as being the 1920s. This is when you have some of the world's greatest Black intellectuals and musicians and dancers and artists kind of coming together and really for the first time being able to write and think and express so much about Black culture in America. So Faith Ringgold grew up around the corner, this is not hyperbole, from Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington. And having an upbringing like this, she sort of said something to the effect of like, it sort of set the standard for what was possible in terms of creative endeavors on the individual level for her. And she was an ambitious young person, very well educated. This is her high school graduation photo in 1948. And from high school, she went to college, the City College of New York. She planned to study art making, but when she got there, she found out that they only let men study that major. So she had to switch to art education. When she graduated, she became an art teacher in the New York City public schools. And then she kept up with her education, working full-time and getting a graduate degree. So here she is over here after earning that degree. You can see that she has added some little ones to her life too. So in addition to working and going to school, she's raising daughters. She had in fact gotten married in 1950. Here she is with her first husband, Robert Earl Wallace. He was a jazz pianist and unfortunately he became addicted to drugs. And so the relationship only lasted 5 years and he died prematurely afterwards. So Faith Ringgold was on her own with her daughters for some time. And I think because she was part of such a strong family, especially in terms of the matriarchal line here, that I think she was able to still provide a very comfortable life for her family. So here she is all dolled up with her daughters who look like they're going off to a dance recital. And then here she is with her mother and her daughters. Once again, they were heading off to Europe on the SS Liberté in 1961. And for Faith Ringgold, this was a reconnaissance mission. She thought she could go to Europe and go to some of the great art museums and sort of get a sense if she could make a living as an artist herself. So just to give you a sense in terms of what her life looks like at the end of the 1950s, going into the 1960s, once again, it's a comfortable existence, even though she's raising her daughters as a single mother. Here she is in her apartment in 1959, and here she is at one of her mother's fashion shows. She would often model for her mother. And she has a good story too about her mother asking her to MC one of these fashion shows one night. And she wasn't really comfortable with public speaking. A lot of people aren't. And so she sort of fumbled at first, and her mother kind of sashayed up, gave her a few pointers, and then sashayed away. And in that moment, Faith Ringgold had to find her footing in front of a crowd. And it was that moment that sort of helped her find her voice. Shortly thereafter, Faith Ringgold meets or marries her next husband, a man by the name of Burdett Ringgold. He's often called Bertie for short. So here they are on their wedding day, and here's Faith Ringgold with her daughters that same day celebrating. And Bertie plays this important role in their life. He becomes a provider. Faith Ringgold is able to leave teaching and become an artist full time. She takes over their dining room in their apartment and really commits herself to creating artwork. Bertie is very supportive. He shows up in her artwork work over the years. This is the two of them flying over the bridge, their arms wrapped around each other. This is a photograph of Bertie from just a few years ago, standing next to a portrait quilt featuring his likeness here. He died just 2 years ago, and the couple had been married for close to 58 years, I believe. So one of the important one of the important ways he supported her her art career is that early on, she was very insistent that she would bring her canvases to galleries to show gallery owners what her work really looked like, as opposed to using slides or photographs or something like that. Seeing it in person was important, but it takes a lot of muscle to haul these things around, especially in New York City. And Bertie was always one to lend a hand. He played an important role that way. So we'll finish up the introduction to the artist with these two self-portraits. So here is Faith Ringgold in 1959. This looks like the young woman who was modeling in her mother's fashion shows. And this is a self-portrait from 1965. And it looks like a lot has changed in those 6 years. In the earlier work, you can see Faith Ringgold is still she's still painting in the style of the European masters that she learned about when she went to school. She's using, highlights and shadow and this kind of elegant brushwork. Over here, she's given herself over to a level of abstraction and created sort of a unique style, a very specific perspective that encapsulates not just her, but as we'll see, a lot of what American culture looked like in the 1960s. This is such a strong self-portrait. I just adore it. So let's turn our attention to her paintings, her interest in capturing issues of race and equality and sexism and social justice in her works of art. So we'll get started right at the beginning. This is 1962, and this is a painting she called "They Speak No Evil." Now, I think Faith Ringgold is doing something really important with her artwork that actually really reminds me of reading a great book. So we all love to read a great novel where the author gives you a protagonist who helps you see the world through a new lens, with a new perspective. That perspective taking is really valuable. Now, in the history of art, generally speaking, there's an assumed, there's an implied white male gaze on a lot of works of art. Think back to, a lot of especially the nudes, the depictions of nude images throughout the history of art. That's, for the implied male gaze. Now, Faith Ringgold forces us to, or asks us to take on a new perspective, her perspective. What does her perspective look like as a Black woman in the United States? So this is a group of white men with these tiny, skinny bodies, these giant heads here, these kind of hollowed out, sort of dispassionate eyes here. Some of them seem to be looking right at you. Some of them seem to be looking past you, but you get the sense that this is like an impenetrable wall. And it's not, there's no empathy here. There's no accommodation. There's no understanding. This is sort of a representation of what power looked like to her. So this is also a really interesting way for a Black female artist to flip the script of 20th century modernism. If we go back to a work like Picasso's seminal Demoiselle d'Avignon from 1907, we can see that Picasso was appropriating images of African masks into this early experiment in Cubism. We see these 5 nude female bodies, and 2 of them have these sort of terrifying mask-like faces here. And they were meant to cause an unsettling effect in the viewer. So Faith Ringgold takes that same kind of experiment that Picasso innovated here. And instead of using African masks, she's sort of using a different mask here. And it has an equally terrifying effect. It's people that you can't quite connect with. And that is, in so many ways, what she taps into, the paradox of of integration, really, in the 1930s, in the 1960s. So she begins this series called the American People series, and she starts it in 1963 as so many things are bubbling up in American culture. You have the assassination of JFK, you have Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the mall in the US Capitol, and you have the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's this kind of vibrant tipping point in American culture in so many ways, but we certainly weren't hearing a lot of from the perspective of Black women. And so Faith Ringgold is offering it up in a picture like this. This is simply called Neighbors from 1963. Can you imagine what it would feel like if these were your neighbors? Can you imagine going home and having people give you this sort of look as you're going into your own home? What do these expressions translate to you? I see scowls, I see disappointment, I see sort of a curiosity here, maybe a little bit of disdain, but certainly nothing that translates to warmth or any sort of sense of welcoming here. So once again, she's asking us to take that perspective, to have that empathy, to see the world through her eyes. The next work in the American People series is sort of similar to one that we've already seen, a sea of these heads and these tiny bodies. This is a work from the same year called For Members Only, which reminds me of like, something you might see at a country club. And so we see these white faces that once again have these cold stares, these hollowed out eyes. Some seem to be looking at you, some seem to be looking past you. None of them are happy to see you. These are very somber sort of grimaces here. But I also want to emphasize how far her work has come in just the space of a year. Look at her use of color over here on the right. I just love these cold, icy blue shadows in the faces of these men over here. Not that the faces are so appealing, but her use of color here is so gorgeous. Now, for most of the rest of the series, she uses primarily a red, white, and blue color palette. And that, of course, is emphasizing that these pictures aren't just sort of standalone. They are here to kind of tell us the story of America. Now, this is a really different picture. It's from 1964, and it's of a solitary figure who sort of overwhelms the frame of this canvas. He can't be contained. He's very close to the picture plane here. It's as though he's coming into our space. He's almost overwhelming us. And he's got this very large head, again, a sort of unfocused stare. Whenever I look at this picture, I sort of get the sense that he's looking over my left shoulder. And then he also has this gesture. And I think it's important to note what's going on with this gesture. Typically, when people speak to you and they have their hand on their chest like this, it's a gesture of sincerity. It's like holding your hand over your heart and sort of giving some, sharing something that's true. But notice his hand isn't quite on his heart. There's a lack of sincerity here. There's a sense that he is just going through the motions in terms of communication because maybe you're not that important. Notice too that she's included all of these subtle arrows throughout the composition, sort of suggesting that your experience with him might be negative, or maybe he is going to bring you down. The name Mr. Charlie in the Black community in the 1960s was a simple way to refer to a racist white man. Mr. Charlie shows up in several pictures in this series. This is called The In Crowd from the same year. I always get the sense that this is like some sort of corporate portrait every time I look at it. We have a group of very well-dressed individuals. We've got an older white man with white hair at the top of this sort of pyramid. There's all of these red arrows pointing downwards, as though as though all of the bad stuff is going downhill here. And you'll notice that as we move down the picture, these gestures, these interactions become more and more malevolent. This figure, of course, is holding his hand in front of this Black man here. He's sort of wrapping his arm around him. Other people are pushing figures down below, but we get the sense that in order to be a part of this in crowd, you have to sort of tolerate the bad behavior or the lack of care or the inhumane treatment that comes from above. So we've got people with different skin colors here, and they're tolerating it. It's as though in order to succeed in American culture, you must tolerate it. Now, this picture sort of knocks my socks off. Faith Ringgold calls it a portrait of of an American youth from 1964. So we see a young Black man, very well dressed. He's wearing a suit, he's wearing a tie, he's sitting in a chair and seemingly just very well behaved, sort of waiting for the next thing to happen. For Faith Ringgold, he was the expression of the promise of young Black men, and sort of the suggestion that the world could be theirs were it not for racism and prejudice. So once again, notice all of these downward arrows that are going to be impacting this young man. Notice the white silhouette sort of hovering behind him. So imagine what could be possible for him if there weren't these influences really acting against him, acting against his best interests. For Faith Ringgold, this was a personal story. Her older brother, Andrew, had been the victim of a racially motivated attack when he was a teenager. When he came home after being beaten up, the wounds were so bad that Faith Ringgold could actually see his skull. Her mother rushed the young man off to the hospital, where the hospital wouldn't even treat him because he was Black. So that was a big and sort of well, it was a big experience that sort of imprinted a lot of messages about American culture on her. Incidentally, her brother never fully recovered from this attack and began to use drugs, died prematurely just a few years before this painting was created. Now, the last of these types of images from the series is this one that I wanted to share with you, which is actually the first picture that she painted in the series. And I think of it so interesting. It's called Between Friends. It's from 1963. Now we see two women of different skin colors. And I want you to just assess for yourself in this moment. Are they friends? Are they sharing some sort of, story or secret between friends? Is there a real connection here? Now, Faith Ringgold painted this when she had been staying with a friend of hers on Martha's Vineyard for the summer. And her friend had sort of an integrated social group, and women would get together every week to play cards. But Faith Ringgold sort of felt like the white women who were showing up were just there to represent their husbands and their husbands' business interests. It was just the right thing to do. That there wasn't a true friendship or a true connection between the white women and the women of color at these card games. And so this was her way of expressing that. So we see that the expression on the white woman here is a little bit hardened, maybe even judgmental, but we see perhaps an attempt at a connection from the woman on the left here, whose face seems to be sort of softened. And we get the sense that if there's something that's being exchanged here between friends, that perhaps it's been sort of offered up by this woman on the left and isn't fully received or shared equally by the woman on the right. Even this kind of wooden structure between them sort of signifies that there is literally something that stands in the way between a true connection here. So just to give you a sense in terms of the scale of these works, here is Faith Ringgold in recent years lecturing next to it. Imagine being her and her husband lugging these works around New York City trying to get a gallery to show them. But now I want to show you three major works from this series that really just might blow you away because they pack a powerful punch. So this is a painting that she created called U.S. Postage, commemorating the advent of Black Power from 1967. So we have 100 faces here. Oh, before I get into it, I just want to say that this is not the size of a postage stamp. This is a very large painting. You can see it can hold a wall here. And obviously, there was no postage stamp created in 1967 commemorating the advent of Black Power. So this is an invention on her behalf. So she has created an image that has 100 pairs of eyes and noses. So all of these gazes, these expressions looking out at us. And so many of them are those cold, hard stares, the hollowed out eyes, the unfocused gazes, reminding us what it feels like as a Black woman to be looked at by white America. There is that true lack of connection, understanding. It's haunting, it's disturbing, but we also have 10 pairs of eyes from Black faces. And you'll notice that they are arranged in this diagonal here. Now, these 10 faces out of the 100 represent that, approximately 10% of the US population at this time was Black. And Faith Ringgold arranges those faces in a diagonal here in the composition. She balances that out with the Black text going in a diagonal in the opposite direction. And that spells out, of course, Black Power. So she creates this X across the center of the picture, which to me, right off the bat, reminded me of the Confederate flag. This is a really interesting way to sort of almost like combat that negative imagery associated with the Confederate flag. But you might also make associations with like Malcolm X, for example. So we have the text of Black Power here, but there, in addition to some of this red text here as well, US postage, airmail, 1967, 10 cents. There's also white text here, and it's sort of providing this underlying structure to this picture. The white text reads white power. Can you even see it? Can you see how she's integrated this? The white text is sideways. Here's our W over here. Sort of have to tilt your head this way. Here's the H, here's the I, here's the T, here's the E. What is she saying about white power that we almost don't even see it in a picture like this? That it's just part of the underlying nature of things. But Black Power, it can be seen so clearly here. I think that this is a really smart composition and a really incredible painting in so many ways. This is the artist standing in front of it in recent years. Here she is at her first solo exhibition in 1967 with this painting in the background. Now, the next major work from the American People series that I wanted to share with you, this is a tough one. I feel like I should have warned you before I put it put it up on the Zoom. So it is simply called Die, and it's 12 feet long. And it is a picture of a race riot. This is a tough picture. I mean, everybody is engaged in combat essentially here. So let's kind of take apart this picture and what's going on here. So we see white men and Black men, white women and Black women. Everybody's kind of dressed the same. The men are well dressed, button down shirts and Black pants. The women are all wearing these little slip dresses, and there are a few children as well here. There's blood everywhere. Some of this is hand-to-hand combat. There's a gun, there's a knife, and all of this is set against this grid of gray squares. Now, for Faith Ringgold, these gray squares represented the sidewalk, and the fact that violence like this was happening all the time. She was aware of violence happening like this all the time, and that it wasn't always on the news. It wasn't always talked about. Sometimes somebody might just disappear, or sometimes there's a huge fight in the street. But in this case, she wanted to represent that everybody here was fighting to hold on to or to raise up their position in society, and that they're kind of willing to do awful things in these moments in order to achieve that. The innocents here are these two children, white and black, who of course are holding each other in terror and not yet aware, haven't yet learned to hate each other here. So they're also kind of our little hope for the future. Now, the Museum of Modern Art actually exhibited Faith Ringgold's picture directly across from Picasso's sort of mid-career masterwork, which is the epic mural of Guernica from 1937, the representation of the violence that befell the Spanish town when it was bombed by the Nazis. Now, Picasso made that violence sort of palatable because he dramatically abstracts it. We can see a figure in a burning building. We see a mother who's lost her child, a soldier with a severed arm here. And he forces us to look at it, to not look away. And that was really Faith Ringgold's goal for this work too. She wanted to create something that people had to look at, had to engage with. Now, the sad postscript to this is that people weren't ready to do it. She would create these things and then she'd end up holding on to it for 40, 50 years. People weren't ready to see them. And incidentally, I worked at an art museum about a decade or so ago where they were considering putting this work on view, getting it on loan as part of a series of her work. And I remember sitting at the table thinking, who's going to come and see this? This is it's so upsetting. And I think I want to say I've changed a lot in a decade. And I think that America has changed a lot in a decade too. People are more willing to have these conversations, these difficult conversations. And so often the artwork serves as a good springboard for starting them. So the last in this series of called the American People series is this work here, which is called The Flag is Bleeding from 1967. Now, once again, there's a lot of blood here, and she intended for that. I mean, she wants to really show what's happening in terms of the violence, particularly around race in the 1960s. This is one of the first times she's integrating the actual flag into her paintings. She's been using those colors though all along. And here she represents a white man, a white woman, and a black man. And they've all got their arms linked together. And so even though there's all this blood and the suggestion of violence, there's this notion that they're in it together. This is part of the very fabric of American culture in some ways, as is perhaps the violence. And so where is all this blood coming from? Well, if you look very closely, you can see that this figure here is holding onto a knife, but he also seems to be the only one of these three figures that is wounded. He's holding his hand up to a wound, and we can see blood's pouring out. But that hand, that gesture is also the gesture of pledging allegiance to the flag. So once again, a really sort of smart commentary here about what it means to be patriotic, dedicated to a culture that really functions in this way. So Faith Ringgold goes on to use the American flag to criticize American culture, very pointed criticisms. She created this work in 1969 in response to watching the moon landing, when our astronauts, stuck that iconic flag into the surface of the moon. And, we've got the stars and stripes waving out there in space. So her flag for the moon has some language embedded in it. And this very subtly in the blue field with the white stars, we see the word die. And she's altered the white stripes and the white and red stripes here into the N word, to the racial epithet here. So together, those two words really make a clear expression in terms of what it felt like for her to be a Black person in America in 1969, and what it felt like to see that flag, the suggestion of colonization, even more so in the heavens. So of course, something like this probably wasn't exhibited that much at the time. And interestingly, even in the past few years, I guess the Chase Manhattan Bank has a pretty distinguished contemporary art collection, and they went looking for a flag created by Faith Ringgold and almost bought this one until they realized that the N-word was embedded in it. So Ringgold continues to be provocative around the issue of using the flag as like a springboard for her artwork. And she and two others launched the People's Flag Show at Judson Memorial Church in 1970. She created this advertisement for it. And here she is with her co-presenters wearing a very stylish outfit that her mother designed. It says, "The American people are the only people who can interpret the flag, a flag which does not belong to the people to do with as they see fit. Should be burned and forgotten. Artists, workers, students, women, third world peoples, you are oppressed. What does this flag mean to you?" So, so this exhibition that they held was very provocative, and it was intended to do so. It was in response to the fact that a gallery owner in New York City had been arrested for exhibiting works of art where the flag was altered. And of course, this sense of desecrating the flag at this time was an arrestable offense. So she and her exhibition co-producers here were arrested for hosting this exhibition. And it's right around this time in her life that Faith Ringgold, who found her voice about a decade earlier hosting fashion shows, now she's using this voice to advance the cause of women and African Americans. She and her daughter, who is now grown, one of her daughters named Barbara Wallace, who becomes an art critic in her own right, a social critic. She's a very well-educated PhD. She turns to her daughter one day after learning that a biennial exhibition at the Whitney included 100 artists and only 2 of them were women. And Faith Ringgold thought, well, that's wrong. That's wrong. We have to protest this. There should be more women included. She asked her daughter, how many should we ask for? And her daughter instantly replies, 50%. So that became their rallying cry. They went out in front of the Whitney and they protested with police whistles. They were putting hard-boiled eggs throughout the exhibition. And of course, this is Faith Ringgold right here. And she starts integrating text into these posters that she was creating. The design here is known as a Cuba textile design, which was inspired by a composition that is frequently used in textiles in the Congo. So of course she's saying freedom, woman now, and then over here, woman, free yourself. She and her daughters co-found so many activist groups around issues of feminism. I don't even have time to name them all, but there are a number of them. She started speaking at feminist conferences, and she's using her voice to really try to agitate for change. You might know a lot of like-minded people, but how many of them actually go out and do something about it? Faith Ringgold was doing something. Now, she creates a number of works throughout her life that respond to national events. And the story of the uprising at the Attica prison was one that really profoundly affected her. This notion that incarcerated people were trying to advocate for more humane conditions in a prison, and then so many of them were summarily executed to end the uprising. That was horrifying to her. So she created this map of American violence that ended up being one of her best-selling works in the 1970s. And you can see she creates the map of the United States and includes all of these known instances of state violence and sort of person-to-person violence. At the bottom, she says, "This map of American violence is incomplete. Please write in whatever you find lacking." And once again, she's willing to kind of put her feet where her mouth is, and she shows up to protest. Nelson Rockefeller was, of course, implicated in the death and the violence at the Attica prison uprising because he was the governor of New York State at the time. He was also the president of the board of the Museum of Modern Art. So here is Faith Ringgold once again with her daughter and other activists. I just love this expression that they're sharing here, where she says, "Impeach Rockefeller, the butcher of Attica. Incidentally, Faith Ringgold would sometimes lead impromptu tours of the Museum of Modern Art, bring people through, and it would really fluster the museum staff because she would say things like, this is the future wing of, the future Martin Luther King Jr. wing of the museum, where they will be exhibiting works by African-American artists, and they'll have this education center here. And she'd go on. And of course, none of these plans were in the works. Only now are art museums thinking about the fact that they have a responsibility to do just that. So she was really decades ahead of her time. Her interest in incarcerated peoples extended to this project. Faith Ringgold got a grant, a $3,000 grant to create a public work of art. And she decided she wanted to make a mural for the women incarcerated at Rikers Island. I didn't even know they had women there, but she went and she interviewed them and talked to them about what they hoped for in their lives once they got their freedom. And that informed the different panels of this particular work. So she's once again using that textile design where she's dividing a square up into these triangular shapes. And she's showing women who are police officers, construction workers, basketball players. We even have a female president of the United States someday. and so all of this was intended to be inspiring to the women who were in prison. Now, incidentally, when it was installed, she was reassured that it was never coming off the walls. It was very safe there. But over the years, the prison readjusted how they were using the space. And so where this mural was installed became a space for the male prison population. And you'll never believe what they did. They whitewashed it. They completely painted over this picture. So here is the artist with the painting after it was completed. And this seems like a good moment to transition to talking about quilts, because here we're looking at a large scale work. It's divided into these different sections. And it was inspired and created by women, telling the stories of women. And that's how we really think about quilts in general and storytelling. So before we get fully into the quilts, I should say we're jumping over a big part of her career. Faith Ringgold sort of went from these political paintings of the 1960s to making soft fabric sculptures like the ones that you see here. She also made masks and did performance art with these masks. But I think just because of the time limitations that we have today and the fact that her quilts are so well known, I'd like to share more about the quilts in general. So let's turn our attention to how she gets started painting on quilts. It's a pretty unusual thing to do, right? She was in Europe at the Rijksmuseum, and a guard sort of brought her over to a section where these Nepalese and Tibetan scrolls were on view. And the scrolls were painted, but they had fabric borders to them, pieced fabric borders. And for Faith Ringgold, this was a revelation, because finally she thought, I won't have to ever rely on anyone, even though it was my husband who was lugging these things around for me. I can just roll up my own paintings and take them around town and show them to people as I need. There was a sense of freedom here. So this is an early series from the early 1970s called the Slave Rape series, of course, referencing the violence and the horrors that African women experienced as part of the slave trade. She modeled these three figures after herself and her daughters, and the titles here are "Fear Will Make You Weak," "Fight and to Save Your Life," and "Run, You Might Get Away." And of course, these are her first, and I love the vibrant colors here, the patterns that she's using in terms of these like stylized leaves and that sort of thing. These are really strong and striking, visceral works here. And these are her first real experiments with integrating paintings and fabrics. Faith Ringgold learns everything she knows about quilt making from her mother. And that's, I think, true for a lot of people who learn quilt making. But she came to it later on in life. This is her and her mother working together on her very first quilt. And in addition to being a dressmaker, Faith Ringgold's mother, I think going down her family line back 4 generations, even to women who were slaves, they were all making quilts, and they handed this practice down generation by generation. So traditionally, we think of quilts as being, part of the domestic sphere. here. They're typically made by women, and they're typically valued less than typical fine art. So Faith Ringgold is doing something wonderful here. She's taking something that is considered more like a craft, more like a woman's domestic product, and elevating it to the realm of like the male fine art world, the art museum world. So she's pushing boundaries here. She's breaking boundaries and elevating something that has been not disdained, but not appropriately valued through the years. Incidentally, she turned to this form of art making because in the early 1980s, she had written her biography, her autobiography, and nobody would publish it. And so she thought, well, I'm going to share my stories in a different way then. This is a quilt called Echoes of Harlem. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I did just want to show all of these wonderful faces that have been painted into this quilt and just emphasize how different it is from her paintings from the 1960s. There's a little bit more life and vitality to these particular figures over here. So her first story quilt she produces in 1983, just after her mother had passed away. So it was her first quilt without her mother too. And it's really innovative in so many ways. It's called Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? And you can almost imagine this as like an actual book that has been taken apart and stitched together in quilt format. So Aunt Jemima, of course, we all know from the pancake mix, is based on a negative stereotype going back to 19th century minstrelsy, and so Faith Ringgold decided that she would invent a new story about who Aunt Jemima was and what her life was like, what her family was like, who she was as a business person. She created an Aunt Jemima here who is an entrepreneur in so many ways, sort of inspired by her own mother and her own life, doing things her own way. So let's zoom in here just for a moment. And you can see that there's wonderful details here. She sort of stitched in the jewelry for this figure over here. And she has included extensive text for each one of these figures in a very specific voice, like a different kind of dialect. You can even think of this title square here as functioning like the title page of a book. So she's being really innovative and sort of changing the way that we see this traditional story and reinventing it really to celebrate African American women. Now, the next quilt I want to show you is from just a couple years later, and it's called the Street Story Quilt from 1985. This is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's the representation in 3 panels of the same building in New York City. And this is also a story quilt, and each of these white rectangles here is packed dense with storytelling. I almost think that she likes to tell the stories almost more than she likes to create the images. So here the story includes the death of a young man's mother by a car accident. You can see the cars down below. Over here, his father dies in a fire. So we can see some the fire truck down below. And then the young man goes off to Vietnam, and a lot of bad things happen to him, but then he ultimately returns home triumphant with his girlfriend. So it's sort of about how he and this community change over time. Here is the artist standing in front of those 3 panels. You can see it's a pretty massive work here. And then a detail, how much text is included, along with sort of the slice of life details from inside this building. This figure here sort of protesting, eviction here. Hell no, we won't go. Uncle Sam don't give a damn, or perhaps protesting the war. So a real sort of thorough investigation of American life in the city. Incidentally, this work was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum by the museum's very first curator of African American descent. So this is the late 1980s that we're talking about here, which is really, I mean, it's 100 years into this museum's history and the first time they have a curator of African descent. So let's keep going here. She's got the Flag Story quilt from the same year, and we can see that the images are are less visceral than what we saw with her paintings. We're in the mid 80s now, and she's relying more on the storytelling to really convey a message here. She's using the flag once again, and it's a really gorgeous flag. She actually partnered with a textile artist named Marquetta Bell Johnson. And in so many ways, she's kind of suggesting the multi-ethnic fabric of America by using these beautiful pieces here. But the story that's included is a really tough one. It's very critical of American culture. It's about a young man who goes to Vietnam. He's wounded. He becomes a quadriplegic, and then he comes home and he's accused of rape by a white woman. So it's a gorgeous image, but the stories are still pack a punch. Now, by the mid to late 80s, a lot of her quilts sort of soften in their nature, and they're more about the Black experience, about Black women's experience. This is called the Lover's Quilt, and that's from 1986. Over here, we have Double Dutch on the Golden Gate Bridge from 1988. I just love this image over here. So again, these are painted quilts with pieced fabric borders to them. And at this point, Faith Ringgold is a known commodity herself. Here she is celebrating Maya Angelou's birthday with Oprah Winfrey. And I believe this is 1988. And at this event, Oprah Winfrey commissions Faith Ringgold to create a quilt of Maya Angelou for her next birthday. And this is the resulting work. It also includes text written by Maya Angelou here. So just for fun, Maya Angelou actually played a quilt maker in one of her movies, How to Make an American Quilt. And over here, you can see Maya Angelou at home with her quilt in the background. Now, Maya Angelou died in 2014, and her estate was auctioned off. And the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas ended up buying the quilt by Faith Ringgold, which is kind of wonderful because Maya Angelou is also from Arkansas. So telling important stories that are associated with the region, but you'll never believe what they paid for this quilt. Less than $500,000, which to me seems like a steal. I can't believe it. So by the end of the 1980s, a lot of Faith Ringgold's work is just about Black or African-American culture. So at this point, she's created a quilt about Michael Jackson here called Who's Bad, sort of celebrating the dancing in one of his music videos. Who doesn't love a great pop culture reference? But see, she's still sort of agitating in the corners here. You can even make out some text that says Rosa Parks up here. So, and even though these dancers aren't fighting, their bodies are as athletic and sort of sprawling as some of those figures that we saw in her political paintings from the 60s. So by the time we get to the early 90s, we reach almost like the height of her career. And I think so much goes to this particular quilt, which is called Tar Beach. The story of Tar Beach was inspired by her own childhood. She and her family would go up to the roof of her building, which had tar paper on it, and they'd call it their beach, their Tar Beach. And that was where they would go to, escape the heat in the summer in the city. And so in this really charming scene over here, we have an invented characters, Cassie Louise Lightfoot, who's lying on a mattress on her Tar Beach with her little brother. Her parents and their neighbors are over here enjoying a meal. And as she's lying there with her brother, she imagines herself rising up into the stars and flying over the bridge over here. It's a really charming story. It was turned into a children's book that has won a number of awards. You can go on YouTube and watch Faith Ringgold read the story to you. And so it's really kind of like her powers in terms of visual storytelling and actual storytelling coming together and being celebrated so nicely. But I wanted to wrap up her experiences with quilt making and story quilts by looking at one particular series called the French Collection. Here she does what she did with the Aunt Jemima quilt. She kind of retells an important story, casting African-American women in a central role. In this case, she's retelling the story of art history, of modernism, with a fictional character who in so many ways is a stand-in for her mother and for herself, an African-American woman who wants to be an artist. So in this quilt, it's called Dancing at the Louvre. She goes to the museum museum to go see the Mona Lisa with a friend and some daughters, and they end up stealing the show, dancing in the galleries, kind of rule breaking, having a little fun while they're at it. The next quilt in this series, which is actually in the collection of the Worcester Museum of Art, I'm not sure how often they have it on view here, is our same protagonist modeling for Picasso. And as she's, modeling in his studio, looking around at the African masks, she begins to think, maybe I could be an artist too. So flash forward to our next quilt. I apologize for the graininess of the image here. She has become an artist, and she's painting in Claude Monet's water lily garden in Giverny. She's surrounded by a group of 10 American feminists, prominent feminists, and she's sort of flipping the historical script in the art world. We've got a male nude model, in this case it's Picasso, who is outside modeling for her as a fully clothed African American artist here. So the last two images from this series, they're just so wonderful, but also just densely packed with references to Black culture and art history. This is Quilting Bee at Arles, featuring Vincent van Gogh and his sunflowers, and the women who are making this quilt are prominent women from the civil rights movement, from Harriet Tubman to Rosa Parks. Over here at the Café des Artistes, we have our protagonist once again, who's surrounded by some of the greatest artists from the Harlem Renaissance, as well as influential artists from early modernism. You've got Van Gogh once again, Paul Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Faith Ringgold makes an appearance over here on the far right. So I think of this as like the culmination of her intellectual and technical capabilities. This is a woman who is so learned in both the fields of art history and in African American history, and she brings them together so beautifully in this series. So we'll wrap up really quickly with a few of her recent works, and I think what I call her renaissance, the world coming to appreciate her in a new way. Now, the sad part of making works on in fabric is that just by displaying them, you're kind of damaging them. And it always sort of, as I was doing the research for this, it kind of broke my heart that you don't see more of her work on view. Well, this is a mosaic that she designed for the New York City subway system at a stop in Harlem, and it's called Flying Home. So she shows all of these prominent figures from the history of Harlem flying through the sky, sort of like her Cassie Louise Lightfoot from Tar Beach. And I just love the idea of people pouring out of the subway at the end of the day, rushing to get home and seeing all of these figures flying through the air the same way. And it's nice that this will always be on view. In the 1990s, Faith Ringgold's reputation was sort of cemented in so many ways. We have her autobiography was finally published. It's called We Flew Over the Bridge, once again, inspired by Tar Beach and Cassie Louise Lightfoot. She also created a foundation called the Anyone Can Fly Foundation, which celebrates African American artists and scholars. And perhaps because her career and her reputation was enjoying this level of success, she was able to dip her toe back into things that were a little bit more political or tougher subject matter. This is a work called We Came to America from 1997. And so, of course, it's dealing with violence in the slave trade. It's a really tough image to look at with this burning slave ship in the background, a reference to New York Harbor here, the Statue of Liberty as a Black woman. And these, these flailing bodies in the water remind me so much of her political works from the 1960s, but they're all also an art historical reference here too. There's an amazing painting at the MFA in Boston called The Slave Ship from 1840, which shows a similar scene. Not so much the faces of Africans that have been thrown into the water, but instead their hands, their feet, and their chains. Faith Ringgold humanizes them over here, shows their terror. Once again, she's responding to national events. So on the day of 9/11, she created some works inspired by, once again, the American flag. But here we get a feeling of unity and resilience. She writes freedom instead of die, right? Across the stars. And she says, on Tuesday morning, we faced the devil in the sky and told him that freedom will never die. So her feelings about the country as expressed by the flag have come a long long way, but that doesn't mean she still doesn't offer up some very pointed criticism here and there. She did a series of prints called The Declaration of Freedom and Independence, sort of contrasting white and Black experiences as related to the text of the Declaration of Independence. So the text here being all men are created equal. We have this sense of what inequality might look like for white Americans. They felt oppressed by having a monarch, but inequality for Black Americans was really the dehumanization of the slave system that existed. And then we go from all men are created equal to and women. So she touches upon women advocating for equality in the texts of Abigail Adams and Sojourner Truth. And then one last one here, this one's called Absolute Tyranny. She contrasts the well-known image by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre, where a few figures were shot in the public square there, to the brutal history of the lynching of Black Americans in this country. So implying that once again there's a real inequality in the way we think of subjugation in this country, really. I think the election of Barack Obama was a sort of hopeful and high point in her career. She created a number of works in reference to him. She was one of 44 artists invited to paint the sculptural bust of him. She goes back and repaints it, I think, because she wanted to maybe reference some of her American flag images. And then Barack Obama served as the inspiration for this work in 2012. She goes back to that Cuba textile pattern with the triangles as part of the square. And she says, born in the USA, with the image of Barack Obama here. So already pushing back on the birther movement, which really reminds me of that painting from 1964 of the young Black man who is full of promise, if only he wasn't subject to racism and prejudice. And I think with Faith Ringgold, she could sort of see what birtherism was and could see that as like those downward arrows impacting a young man who is full of promise. So in her, in recent years, she's been really innovative. She actually created an app inspired by the game Sudoku. She calls it Quildoku, and it's the same logic puzzle, but it's visual pieces. And you have to figure out where they go. And at the end, you get your own Faith Ringgold quilt. And happily, I think her work is being reassessed and newly appreciated. So the mural that had been whitewashed at Rikers Island was completely preserved. They were able, because it was whitewashed on an oil paint, they were able to remove it. And now it's heading to the Brooklyn Museum of Art. The artist is thrilled because more people will see it. And some of those very challenging paintings that she created in the 60s are only now entering major collections. This is October 21st of last year. The National Gallery acquired The Flag is Bleeding, for instance. And then very happily, she now has a retrospective in her hometown of New York City at the new museum that will be on view. It opened this month. It will be on view until June. And so it's an opportunity to see so many of her works all together, including that French collection series that is actually a collection of 12 quilts. Many of them are privately owned now. So it's a rare opportunity to see them together. So we'll wrap up tonight thinking about this woman and this incredible career that she has, how far she's come. And I will just say that she's won close to 100 awards in her life. She's 23 honorary doctorates to her name, but she is somebody who broke boundaries by her very artistic practice. And along the way, she's advocating for the equality and advancement and the free speech of fellow artists. So Faith Ringgold is somebody who found her voice and told her story in such a beautiful way. And I think that America and the art world are better for it. So I will end there, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about Faith Ringgold.
Jane, that was an absolutely tremendous presentation. Thank you. I have heard of Faith Ringgold, and I have read some children's books that have been written. Tar Beach is one, but you always manage to bring in other aspects of the artist's life and their legacy. So thank you for that. I appreciate all that. And yeah, absolutely wonderful. I see some things coming up in the chat here. And so I'm going to end the recording of the program tonight, but please don't go away. We're going to stay available for questions. Let's see here.